Welcome back, and we rejoin the racing halfway through the second lap as the leaders head up Brownloaf Hill. Nick Craig had put in an amazing effort to rejoin the lead four, and that could really change the complexion of the race, with Gary Ford now taking a break at the back of the pack. Knowing how hard Nick will have worked to get there, David once again turns the screw as he ups the pace to see if Nick has still got enough in reserve, before he has time to recover to stay with the group. A minute off the pace in sixth was Peugeot's Fred Salmon. Fred had been Nick and Tim Gould's teammate last year, but now on his own, with only one top 5 result so far this season, he was struggling to stay with the leaders. Fred was also no doubt aware that Orange's Chris Young, who is a notoriously slow starter but strong finisher, was closing the gap behind him, while the two Tims, Gould and Davis, who were still looking for their evasive form of fitness, had slipped to 8th and 9th. And for any of the riders who thought that Aldershot would be flat and therefore not technical, there were some painful lessons. On the women's second lap, Jill Smith was now completely in control and starting to ease off to ensure she had no mechanicals, while behind her, Deb was being hampered by a problem with her rear gears in her attempts to lose Sally. She would get away on this twisty single track only to find Sally right back on her wheel when they hit the fire tracks. Heading up Brownloaf Hill, and this time Jill made sure she was ahead of the struggling men. She glances behind, but it was nearly a minute till the chasers followed, and this time Sally had gotten in front and was looking strong as she rode all the way up the climb ahead of Deb. Picking up the men at the compression towards the end of the second lap, and the lead group was yet again being stretched out by David, and the elastic was about to break for Nick and Adrian as they had dropped back on the climb up Sandy Hill. Once again, Gary had had his work cut out to stay with David, while Barry sat behind on guard duty. And unbeknown to him, as they headed back into the trees, Barry lost his saddlebag, which contains all his spare tubes and tools in case of a mechanical. Fred was still hanging on to sixth, but Chris was now in sight, while behind the two Tims were losing touch. Pete Stevenson of Saracen was the leading amateur in 10th. As with many of the pros, David is an all-rounder, and at the start of the season I asked him where he would be concentrating his efforts.
All my season really is going to be based around mountain bike events. I'll be doing very little road racing, maybe doing some midweek ones and some early season road racing, and that's it really.
Well, the midweek ones tend to be criteriums then?
Yeah, they'll be just like the circuit races, which is only an hour racing, which is good preparation really and good speed work.
Behind the leading trio, Nick didn't have the energy for another chase, and with two teammates ahead of him, it wasn't in Adrian's or Rally's interest to try and close the gap. But at least for Gary, it was now only 2 against 1. And as Nick realised that Adrian was not going to do the work, he again had to go to the front to try and stay away from the chasers. Heading up Sandy Hill for the second time, and by just keeping it steady, Jill had increased her lead to nearly 2 minutes, assisted by the fact that Deb had dropped down the field due to her gears, and a tiring Sally was now chasing on her own. Now up into third was Sian Roberts, and as we move into the second half of the race, her stamina was again beginning to show as she starts trying to reel in Sally, who still looks far from comfortable on the technical stuff compared to a smooth Sian.
Hi, Sian.
At the start of the women's third lap, the Canadians' road experience seemed to have effectively done the job, and despite a windy day that had increased the desire of the men to ride in groups, Jill had gone it alone and been in the front almost from the gun. Sally was raising eyebrows with her second strong ride on the trot, and will no doubt have gained confidence just from knowing she could stay out front with the best of them. But again her stamina was questionable, as behind her Sian was rapidly closing the gap and could now see Sally on the long straight sections. In fourth, Orange's Janet Wilkinson was having her best ride of the season and looking more like her 91-92 form, while another relative newcomer, Michelle Bergstrand, was also heading for her first top 5 finish in the year. And while Jill had put down the hammer and increased her lead to 2 minutes, Sian had overhauled Sally and was now setting about making the gap large enough to discourage any retaliation, which, judging by the look on Sally's face, seemed fairly unlikely. As the men set off on their fourth lap, the rally tactics seemed unclear, as David had been at the front for most of the last couple of laps, and if he was to have the strength at the end, he would need to take a breather at some point. Gary was obviously not going to relieve him at the front, but it was surely only a matter of time till Barry took over. Behind them was another trio. Chris had caught up with Adrian and Nick, but instead of sitting at the back and recovering, he went straight to the front and upped the tempo in a final assault on the leader's gap. While behind them in 7th was a lonely Fred, who would be looking to secure his position, unless someone in the group ahead were to get kicked out of the back. And it wasn't long before Adrian started to fade under the relentless pressure of Chris's attack, and he was rapidly becoming bait for Fred Salmon. Further down, Tim Davies was comfortable in 8th, and Peter Stevenson moved up to 9th, ahead of Tim Gould. Nearing the top of Sandy Hill, and it was Barry, the 91 and 92 hill climb champion, who had gone to the front and was powering up the climb. So while Gary was having to work to stay with Barry, David was getting a breather at the back. But all the plans came tumbling down when Barry crashed in the woods, which delayed David but let Gary get away. Now the race was really on, and it was a dejected-looking Barry who came out of the trees.
Catch and punch it again.
That made it 3 punctures in 3 races, and of course he had lost his saddlebag earlier, so couldn't fix it, which meant he had to retire. So Chris and Nick were now battling for 3rd.
What I need is a good push.
Back on Sandy Hill, Fred had the right idea. Coming off Brownloaf Hill for the final time, David was back on terms, and it looked like it would be cat and mouse to the finish, with neither rider wanting to overexert themselves, but they couldn't play around too much, as behind them the gap had been whittled down to just 1.5 minutes, with Chris doing most of the damage, and a tiring Nick just trying to stay with it. The lead was constantly swapping, with both riders looking for a mistake from the other and a chance to jump clear. But as the women's race came into the last half mile, there were no questions about the winner, with Jill now 3 minutes clear of Sian, who was perfectly satisfied as she would be collecting the full 16 points for first place, as Jill is not British. As David breached the top of Sandy Hill, he had no breath for pleasantries as he passed his teammate's wife, since Gary was still right on his wheel. And behind them, Chris had finally shaken off the tiring Nick and now looked certain of his first podium spot this season. Heading into the last half mile, Gary tried to make a break, but David wasn't going to let him get away and obviously fancied his chances in a sprint finish. So Jill took her first win on British soil with decorum, ahead of Sian, who was afforded the luxury of a ringside saddle, as Gary and David contested the sprint. Gary getting it by half a wheel, and he was rather pleased.
Well, I really like this course. It's nice and fast, and it wasn't muddy today, so I was able to ride fairly fast, which I really like.
Do you think your road experience?
Yes, definitely, because I just tuck down as far as I can go on the road bits and on the sort of straightaways and hammer.
I can't remember if it was myself or David attacked on the single track, and that got rid of Nick and Adrian, and then I believe Barry punched on the penultimate lap. So I was quite pleased with that. But I mean, David had done his fair share and he wasn't really prepared to contribute on the last lap, which is how bike racing is. So I had to do a little bit of work.
And the sprint at the end, just managed to shake it.
Well, it looked like if it had been a bit longer, he'd have had it, but it wasn't longer, so.
So I was a bit disappointed really. My chain came off on the last corner. I think I would have had it easily, but that's the way it goes really.
Yeah, Gary said you seemed to have a problem.
Yeah, I was just like spinning really and just got my chain on as quick as I could and lost it there really. But he had a bit of a lead and I came back to him and it was very close at the end.
That win for Gary means we've had a different victor in each round so far, and Fred finally overcame Adrian to get 5th. In the women's race, it was also a 3rd winner out of 3, and with a performance like that, I'm sure that the Brits will be pleased to know that Jill is back off to Canada for the rest of the season. The overall position is still very close in the men's, though Gary will miss the next round as he will be doing the World Cup. While in the women's standings, Sean moves ahead of Deb, who finally finished 6th. From the flattest, we move to the highest course next week, when we're in the shadow of Snowdon for round 4 of the 7-Up BMBF National Points Series.